Believe you me, I have a detector. I can feel it in my spirit. I feel it in my fingers. And I feel it in my toes that he is capable. He's going to be facilitating panel session 1. And there are panelists there, Dr. Joan van Niekerk, who is the consultant at Jelly Beans. We have Dr. Chantel Ritten, University of Free State, and the nutrition lead of SACS Watch, and Helen Nyangoya. Forgive me for mispronouncing your surname, Helen Nyangoma, who is the Senior Child Protection Specialist at UNICEF. I am now handing you over to Edward Adai. All the best for this session.
Thank you very much, Tazoma. And thank you very much for handing over the candle of hope to me. For me, this session is about hope. It's about dignity, but it's also about enabling the agency of our children. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the session on building a resilient Africa through advocacy and advancing child rights. Can I also invite Prof. Anne to also put on her video so the session just flows? Excellent. Thank you very much. And can I invite my panelists to wave to everybody? I don't pretend that I can meet the spirit and the drive of Tazoma, but we'll try and keep all of you excited. The session actually seeks to share experiences and good practices on making the Leave No Child Behind Charter instrumental in creating a resilient Africa. For us, a child is a child. All children deserve to be loved. All children deserve care and support to achieve their physical, social, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual well-being. Every child deserves that. Unfortunately, a lot of children do not feel safe at home, in schools, in their communities, and online. It is these places where most of the violence, unfortunately, tends to take place. And it's often perpetrated at the hands of people who these children interact with. The people who are supposed to love, care, and support our children are the people who unfortunately violate them, exploit them, and abuse them. And so I'm particularly pleased to be part of this conference and in particular this session. The 2020 African Child Trauma Conference is really about giving hope. And thank you, Tazoma, once again for the candle of hope that you have handed over to me. It's trying to deal with something that really challenges our humanity. And violence, exploitation, and abuse really challenges our humanity. So I'd like to start the session with an interactive part that really I'd like to invite all of you to share your experiences in the chat box. Just recall someone who you know has experienced trauma associated with violence. What's the name of this person? The name of the person that comes to my mind is Josephine. What's the name of yours? Is it a male or a female? What kind of violence did the person experience? Physical, sexual, emotional? Was it bullying, corporal punishment, attacks in the school or community, sexual harassment or cyberbullying? I'm inviting you to share your experience. How old was this person? How old was your Josephine? When did it take place? Who was the perpetrator? What happened to this perpetrator? Did your Josephine report the incident? And did he or she get services, support, and care? Can you imagine how long your Josephine has been living with this experience, this trauma, how it had affected his or her life. Did she ever heal? This conference is about our Josephines. And I'm inviting you to share your experiences in the chat box. I'm inviting you to keep your Josephine in mind throughout this session and throughout this conference. If this conference does not lead to practical, essential actions that give hope, dignity to our Josephines, then we haven't done enough. So I'm going to invite our panelists to begin to help us reflect on a couple of questions. And I don't think we can deal with all the questions in this particular panel. So I also invite you to reflect on these questions throughout this conference. And the question that is on my mind at the moment, and I hope it's on yours, is why is violence so ubiquitous in our society? Why do we have so much violence going on in spite of our efforts? What are the systems and what environments continue to sustain violence in our homes, in schools, in communities, and online? Can we imagine a world without violence, abuse, and exploitation? What does it look like? What do we need to do to create this world? A world that prevents other Josephines from the experience of violence, exploitation, and abuse. A world that makes it difficult for perpetrators to commit and get away with the violence. A world that continues to provide support and services and care to the Josephines that experience violence. A world that limits the lifelong and intergenerational trauma of violence. Nobody deserves that. Violence has no place in our society, but it continues to be pervasive in our society. So let me invite my eminent panelists, starting with Dr. Joan Van Niekerk, to say a few words about the Leave No Charter behind and some of her thoughts on some of the critical actions that we as a collective should be taking as we move towards developing this emergency action plan, as we operationalize the emergency action plan. Joan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eddie, and some very challenging questions. And I've thought a lot about this panel, you know, advancing children's rights and sharing knowledge and so on. So I was thinking that for me, there are 3 or 4 areas that I have enormous concern about. First of all, we focus so much on response and we put so much money into response, but we do not look at prevention. And prevention is needing to be a long-term strategy. We know that violence comes down generations. We know a lot about intergenerational violence. And we need to help politicians understand that there's no quick fix. We need them to commit to the kinds of programs that are long-term, that recognize the needs of children over the extent of their childhood, rather than having the quick knee-jerk responses and the, how can I say, the focus on response, the pouring of resources into response. Secondly, I thought a lot about knowledge. Knowledge is sharing knowledge as part of the heading for this particular panel. And it concerns me that knowledge seems to be the prerogative of those who are well educated, those who perhaps sit in universities, etc. One of the things that has frustrated me as a practitioner for many years is the fact that there is a gap between the academics and the field, and the knowledge does not always become exchanged. New research, access to journals is denied to the field simply through its cost. I would like to see universities open up their libraries to people who work on the ground. And there's such potential for this now in terms of electronic media. You don't have to go to a library and take out books. But practitioners in the field find it so difficult to acquire new knowledge because they don't have access to the resources, particularly in the social service professions, where salaries are not great and access to a university library is quite an expensive exercise. That sharing of knowledge is also kind of problematic to me from the point of view of we want research. We do not always give enough value to practice knowledge. And it's often practice knowledge that generates the hypotheses for more advanced structured research that then enables us to develop and know which are the evidence-based programs. So there needs to be a greater respect, I believe, for practice knowledge from academics to practitioners. And practitioners need more access to the kind of knowledge generated at university level. There needs to be a greater degree of exchange and respect. The other thing I think is incredibly important, the Minister was saying about collaboration. In South Africa, and I cannot speak for other African states, but in South Africa, our child protection system, apart from being focused on response, is so splintered. People do not work together. They do not respect each other's roles. This is vital if we are going to comprehensively protect children's rights in this country. Even within a department, you have silos of, what would one call it, interest. You have a silo for families, you have a silo for children, you have a silo for victim empowerment. What are we doing? Because these silos should be working together. There should be constant interactions and connections between them. And the same goes for budgeting. If we really want to make this world, this country, this region, a child protective environment, we need to look at how we budget for children and how we share budgets for children. Sorry, this is my money, and I will keep it within my silo, whether I'm an NGO or whether I'm in government. Why don't we pool more resources and make them available to shared projects so that we can work more comprehensively? And the last thing I want to say is we need to listen to children. This has been a year for me of greater focus on child participation. Here I am, I won't even tell you how many years in practice, but there are many years. I've learned so much from children this year. Why aren't we listening more? We have our fancy ideas in our head as to what children need, but sometimes we need to get back into hearing from children what they think they need. So that's my thoughts on our particular subject today.
Thank you very, very much.
Sorry, Eddie. Excuse me, Eddie. Just to let you know, guys, I'm so sorry. Just to let you know that we have about 4.5 minutes left now. So I'm just letting you know that time is a bit tight here. Okay, okay, Eddie.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joan. Let me invite Chantel to offer some thoughts. Chantel?
Thank you, Edward. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share in this platform, because for a long time, the Food and Nutrition Fraternity for Children has been looking for a space that we can engage. And all the points that have been raised now about putting children first, collaboration, synergy in funding, these are issues that we are all grappling with. And I think the opportunity for us to actually engage, whether on platforms like this or in spaces like this, help us to build. And your first question, Eddie, was why do we think there's so much violence? Well, from a food and nutrition perspective, hungry people are angry people. And until we start taking the food issue as not only a health issue, but a social justice issue, we are going to still grapple with violence for a very long time. So my contribution is that firstly, we are starting to go across our silos. The very fact that we have this opportunity to share knowledge is important. Secondly, we need to engage at a local level. And I think that it's important that we have this international platforms, but at the same time, if we want to bring about change, it has to start at a local level. And then we start to build our social networks to engage collectively, because this is about children's rights. It's not just a violence agenda. It is all children's rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hungry people are indeed angry people. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eddie and fellow panelists. From my side, I'm going to talk about a category of children on the move. So this includes migrant children, refugees, internally displaced, and children who, for one reason or the other, decide to move or are forced to flee their homes. So as we all know, in the African continent, most of the migrants that move stay within Africa. And from what data tells us that 1 out of 4 international migrants is a child. So that roughly makes it to about 6.5 million migrant children on our continent alone. Our continent is a continent that's been built on migrants over time. Most of us sitting on this panel and also on this webinar, on this conference, probably at one point in life have had to move from one place to another. So children on the move, as we know, they flee violent situations from their home country. As they move, as they transit, they face a lot of violence, gender-based violence, they face discrimination, with the hope that when they get to their destination country, they're going to be welcomed in our African nature, that we welcome guests. But this is not the story. This is not the reality for the children. When they arrive in most countries, they're met with even increased violence. We hear all the time around xenophobic violence. We hear around discrimination. We hear around stigma that are associated with people who come into our countries, into our borders, into our provinces, which is so unlike African. We don't offer them that warmth and reception that African spirit is built upon. So with that, with the trauma that they've faced from their homes, through the transit, and at the point of arrival when they say, okay, this is where my journey ends, but that also begins the journey of another form of violence. So the hope is immediately dashed. So I think what we can really learn is, let's go back to our basics, the Africanness in all of us, the welcoming nature, the non-discrimination. Let's advocate and eradicate violent behaviors towards migrants, towards people who come into our borders. Let's make our services available, be it education, be it health services. We know with COVID, especially, everyone has been impacted, and especially this group, even prior to COVID, they were already left behind. So with COVID, we now face a situation where they're going to be at risk of being left behind again. Let's provide them with the space, let's engage them, let's consult them, and really let's go back to the basics of Africanness, the Ubuntu spirit of welcoming children on the move and migrants within our own communities.
Thank you very, very much, Helen. Ubuntu spirit, we should work together the spirit of Africanness. So colleagues, as we segue into Anne's presentation, let me summarize some of the ideas that have come out that could potentially be considered as we look at the emergency action plan. The first is that there will be no quick fixes. So it should be a commitment to the long term. The second is that we should prioritize vulnerable groups in addition to children who are on the move. The third is that we should focus on prevention. Prevention is actually treatment, and ensure that the response looks at prevention in addition to all the work that we are doing in responding. The fourth is we should bridge a knowledge gap in terms of ensuring that there's the gap between what is known by academics and what happens at the community is bridged. Understanding that even if we know things at the academic level, at the local level, is the people who are experiencing it. So we must also go to them and get their indigenous knowledge. And with that in mind, we should invest in listening to children, listen to their experience. And lastly, the emergency plan should provide a platform for collaboration on content, collaboration on resources, collaboration on budgets. So these are some of the thoughts that have come up, and we hope that these thoughts can be reflected more substantively in the emergency action plan and to be discussed throughout the course of this conference. But last but not the least, we should move away from thinking that violence is an issue that is limited to a particular sector. It's a multi-sectoral issue. Remember always that a hungry person is an angry person. Thank you very much, Joan. Thank you very much, Chantel. And thank you very much, Helen. And thank you to all the panelists that have continued to share their experiences. Please continue to share your experiences. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Anne Skelton to make her presentation. And I believe, Tazoma, you want to take over from here.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Thank you very much, Eddie. And thank you very much to all your panelists. You see, I'm very nice because I gave you a little bit more time so that you could finish, because we realized that this is very, very important. But thank you very much. Now, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, there are no questions and answers. We've been checking our Q&A box. So we are not finding any questions any questions to you, Eddie, and the panel. So I think you've said it loud and clear. So no one is asking any question. And secondly, there was a question that was posed by somebody to UNICEF when Marika was talking about the project in Salt River, where somebody was asking if that project, there's any plans to expand the project. And I sourced the answer for you. Yes, especially in the Western Cape, they are busy talking with the mayor, and they are planning to expand it to 3 more sites in the Western Cape. And as they move forward, then they will see. But you were asking in particular about the Western Cape. So the answer is yes, 3 more sites are in the pipeline in the Western Cape. Then number 3, hey, you must listen to this one. There's a competition. Woo-hoo! There's a competition. How does the competition work? The competition is going to work like this. You are going to take a selfie of yourself. A selfie of yourself. You get what I'm saying, hey? A selfie is that of yourself. So you're going to take a selfie and post it on the number that I'm going to give you. Please have your pens ready, because I'm going to be giving you the number. Because this is a competition. At the end, we're going to be announcing who the funniest of those photos is and who the most glamorous is. So you take a selfie and you send it to 072 233 3708. Did you get that? Take a selfie and post it to 0722 333 708. And keep your fingers crossed that you are either the funniest or the most glamorous one. That's the competition that you are going to be announcing at the end. I hope you all got that. If you missed the number, please chat to me and I will gladly send the number back to you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to allow a minute or two because we are now going to the streams. We are going to be having two streams, which is stream A and stream B. I will be facilitating stream A, and I have my learned colleague in the field of radio, Ms. Carol Bauer, who will be facilitating stream B. And ladies and gentlemen, just a minute, I'm being told something that I need to say to you now. Okay, we have a speaker before we move to the streams, ladies and gentlemen, who needs to speak now because of some things that have just changed. And now, before we go to the streams, I'm going to allow Professor Ann Skelton, who is going to be addressing us now, Children in Time of COVID-19, Rights versus Best Interest. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us now welcome Professor Ann Skelton, and thereafter, I will let you know how we go into the streams. Over to you, Professor Skelton.
Thank you very much, Tazama. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's wonderful to be part of today's conversation. I'm going to be talking about the best interests of the child, which, as you all know, is a very important concept in children's rights. For example, in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it says that in every matter concerning a child, the best interest must be a primary consideration. And under the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, this is even stronger because it says the primary consideration. And in some African constitutions, we talk about the paramount consideration. So we can see then that best interest is kind of elevated and seen as being hugely important. Indeed, it is important because we see it as an interpretive principle that helps us interpret rights in the Convention and the Charter and the Constitution. And it's also a very important procedural right because every child has a right to have their best interests considered when they are being, when decisions about them are being made. And in that regard, we must also remember that there is a kind of twin principle, and that is the principle of participation. Children's right to be heard and to have their views considered must be factored into a best interest determination. However, it's very important as well to keep our eye focused on all the rights that are there for children. And the reason why I say this is because best interests is somewhat open to interpretation. This in some ways is its strength. It's flexible, and so it can be applied in lots of different situations. But it does pose a risk as well, because we may find that a powerful adult might make an assessment that something's in a child's best interest, but actually there is a right that is being cut across. Now, let me give some illustrations from this time period where we have had our world changed by COVID-19. What we saw here was that very many governments decided that collectively for children, it would be in their best interest to stay at home and not attend school. If we look at that from a rights perspective, there were a number of rights that were then being cut across or limited. Obviously, the right to education was a big thing that was suspended during COVID-19. And with that went the right to nutrition, because so many children receive their main meal at school. So suddenly children were plunged into a situation of not being at school and not receiving sufficient food and nutrition. And in addition, because children were more in confined spaces within families, many of which were poor families and so on, this could mean that they were more at risk from violence, abuse, and of course, risks to their mental health. So although overarching, yes, best interests might have been considered to be important to keep children safe from the virus, but at the same time, what rights were being limited and how far could states go in limiting rights like that? I'm going to come back to that question of when and how rights can be limited, but let me just continue to talk about some of the rights that we saw being cut across during the COVID time. The right to health, including the right to mental health, was severely affected. And for example, normal primary healthcare issues such as vaccinations and so on, we've seen on the continent that vaccination numbers have dropped dramatically. And this, of course, can place children at grave risk going forward. And so we'll have a lot of catching up to do in terms of vaccinations. Let's take children in need of care and protection, children who are in residential care. I saw in the chat a question from Marty, and she was asking, well, what about children who haven't had visits from parents? Indeed, this is a very big issue, because the right there is that children have a right not to be separated from their families any more than is absolutely necessary for their care and protection. And so by stopping children from having visitors is in my view, an overreach in terms of what is needed. Children in prisons, children in the criminal justice system were simply for a while kept where they were in the child and youth care centers or the prisons, because it was deemed safer or more in their best interests than being taken to court, which was perceived as being risky, especially in the early stages. And so some governments then just kind of left that situation hanging. Others took some steps to say, right, let's start moving children out, let's start bringing them back to court. The backlogs in the criminal justice system, think of children who are waiting for trials to come up where they are the victims and they will have to testify. Think of the DNA testing. That has gone completely out of the window because of all of the stresses on the system of COVID testing. Means that DNA tests needed for forensic or for criminal justice reasons have gone now into a very long queue. So it's very important to think about the fact that whilst governments are making decisions, we need to be aware of what the limits on rights violations or rights infringements, or maybe just rights limitations. How does that work? How should that work? Just before I move on to limitations of rights, I think it's also very important to remember that that rights are indivisible. So, we don't say that one right is more than any other right. We have to keep them all sort of in the balance and in the mix. So can rights be limited then? Can children's rights be limited? Well, yes, in a public health emergency, rights can be limited. And I would say it's reasonable to say that even children's rights can be limited, although when you are limiting children's rights, there's kind of an extra responsibility to ensure that that those limitations are as limited in nature as possible. So how should rights limitations work? Well, there are 4 main principles that we should keep in mind. First of all, any limitation of a right must be tailored to the absolute necessity. in order to fulfill the purpose that that limitation is aiming for. So if the purpose of the limitation is to protect the health and life of children and others, then it should only go so far as it needs to achieve that. The second thing is it has to be really justifiable. There have to be good reasons for it. And when we talk about justifiability, we need to have good evidence, good science, good support. And I don't only mean health science, because we've seen in the pandemic that there's been a great recourse to health professionals. Wonderful. We needed them. We needed their help and their guidance. But they don't have the full picture of what goes into a child's safety, a child's mental health, a child's rights protections beyond only the right to health. So we need a more multidisciplinary approach to how to balance rights. We also, these rights limitations have to be reasonable. So we should not go further than we need to go, and we must be reasonable in the way that we limit rights. And by the way, something like setting curfews and then arresting children because they've broken those curfews, in my view, would be absolutely an unreasonable and disproportionate response to what you're trying to achieve. Finally, any limitations on rights must be time-bound. So they should be for the shortest appropriate time that you can possibly make them. And so if we go back to that example that Marty put in the chat about not having visitors, I mean, why was it for such a long time that children were not permitted to have visitors? Because this actually, the health risk that was involved in that can be managed in other ways. So one actually needs to look at more reasonable measures, more tailored measures, and more time-bound measures to achieve what we want to do. So I think in some instances, we've seen governments all around the world, not only in Africa, sometimes going too far, you know, bringing a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Maybe this was not too unreasonable given the fact that this was the first time that such a major pandemic has occurred in the modern era, at least. And so some errors have been made. But, you know, we've got to learn from this experience and make sure going forward that we don't make these mistakes. Now, because there's been so much talk about hope, I want to try and end on a hopeful note and to say that, you know, crisis also brings opportunity. And what we can do now is we can start to build back using a more rights-based approach. We've got to really think about how do we do better in the future? We've heard from some of the speakers in the panel about the importance of prevention work, about the importance of support work. And these are the things that we need to see, and we need to attach them to the rights in the convention and in the charter and make sure that we stand up and are strong on these issues in saying we don't want quick fixes. We don't want highly retributive, punitive approaches. What we want is actually more support for children who have experienced harm or experienced trauma, and more resources in government to prevent that and to respond to it in a supportive way, providing much more support around the victim, and making sure that we provide ongoing support for that child and the family that that child lives in through thinking about rights in a multifaceted way. So providing good support to families through support grants, through access to nutrition, through access to education, and all of the things that go together to making up a trauma-free life for a child. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor Anne Skelton. Before you run away, there are just a few questions that I'm going to, that have been dropped in our Q&A box. The first question is, are there any plans to include inclusive education across primary and high school as these children fall along the wayside if not monitored, as they cannot cope in the mainstream? And then I will pose the second and third question so that you try and condense them in your response. Question 2, the person is saying there are so many children who are not at school due to various reasons, even pre-COVID. Even pre-COVID, children have been out of school. Are there any plans from government to motivate parents, as education is a right? And again, teenage pregnancy is another issue. And perhaps programs, are there any programs that can address this challenge? And the substance abuse challenge, are there? There's no motivation to be or do anything better with their lives. Some children are exposed to these elements on a daily basis. Is there anything that you are doing about those? And the last question, I promise you, this is the third and the last. What can parents and children's rights activists do to lobby government to take the multidisciplinary approach to protecting children that you mentioned? I will remind you if you forget any.
Hopefully I won't need reminding as I was scribbling down on a piece of paper.
Yes, yeah.
First question was about inclusive education. I should just mention, in case people are unclear, that I don't work for the government, so I can't answer for government, but I can give you my observations about what government should do. We know that the number of children with disabilities who are not in any form of education is a major problem for South Africa, which government needs to prioritize. And then indeed, the move to inclusive education needs a great deal of resourcing, because we need support for children if they're going to move from special education into the mainstream. And that work, although our policies say that that's what should happen, government has already committed itself to that. They don't need to be persuaded to do that, but they need to perhaps think through how is it going to be made effective, because it is quite a cost-intensive process, but really planning and budgeting is the place to start. There are many out of children's school, and there were before COVID. Yes, that is true. There are a number of things that impede children from going to school. We tend to have quite a high enrollment rate in South Africa. I'm thinking now from a South African perspective in the early years, but we see that diminishing over years. But of course, there are many other countries in Africa where there are many children out of school. Nigeria has one of the highest numbers of out-of-school children in the world, for example. So the factors can be poverty. So poverty alleviation and support for families is one of the ways that we need to do it. Of course, removing any financial barriers, so school should be free, and also we must try to do away with all the hidden costs that might be there as well. And then when it comes to adolescence, we need to look at what are the factors. Somebody mentioned teen pregnancy, but that just might be only one of a number of factors that tend to cause adolescents to leave school early. So again, it's being a little bit more vigilant too about when children stop attending school. How much follow-up do schools and governments really do about where did those children go? Why have they stopped coming? What could be done to retain them, to bring them back in? What could parents do to help with this? Well, again, I think if the conversations start happening about why children aren't coming to school, then jointly with parents and communities, we could try to find some of the solutions. And then lastly, how do we convince government to listen more and to work more in a multidisciplinary approach? Well, we must just keep talking about it on all our platforms, on the importance of it. Perhaps when, I think at the early on stages of COVID, everyone was in sort of survival mode and that kind of thing. But again, we could say that for any future such emergency situations, we would want a more multidisciplinary team guiding decision-making and ensuring that children's rights specialists are included in the mix of those with a broader perspective than just a health perspective.
Thank you so much, Prof. The last two questions, you know, the last two questions, because we need to be going to streams at 10 past. And this question says, as children have a right to education, but schools are not accepting children, even though parents have applied online. What would be the next step in this regard? District offices are approached, but not helping at all. And then the last question, this person is saying, I have noticed a high rate of suicide attempts during pandemic due to the limitations. What programs can be put in place to balance parenting skills without limiting the children?
Yes, well, I think first of all, on this issue of education and placement in schools, I think one of the difficulties that we've had is that with the move to online registration, some people find that there are a lot of problems in trying to access those platforms at the right time and that kind of thing. So that is something that I think is an ongoing project to try and make that more accessible, though one can understand why government wants to move to a more automated system. The other thing that I think we should be doing there is, you know, bringing this to the attention of NGOs that work on education rights. There are a number of those, such as Equal Education and Section 27. They're kind of, they intersect with the children's rights sector, but they are in fact more education oriented. So we should start building bridges across NGO thinking, not to just think about children's rights, but to also look at the right to education and see who's working in those spaces. And I think that kind of intersectionality is happening more and more, I'm pleased to say. On the issue of suicide attempts, I mean, this is all about providing good access to children. Now, children have been very isolated during this COVID time. And so perhaps because we didn't have time to think and plan before, it may be that insufficient thought went into what services and support should we be providing to children, even including online, but also through other mechanisms in order to make sure that children would have someone to speak to. And the other part of that question was, what about parenting and how could parenting be changed so that children could be assisted more? I think this is a broader conversation we should be having. You know, as you all know, the children's right to be protected from violence in the home, including corporal punishment, was given a boost last year when the Constitutional Court banned corporal punishment in the home, or more accurately said that if parents use corporal punishment in the home, they won't have any special defense if they are charged with assault. But what we really need to see from government is a rollout of campaigns supporting parents and showing them how to do more positive parenting, convincing people that there actually are many other ways to discipline children besides using violence, and showing how actually many other benefits to relationships can occur within families when other parenting methods are used. But people are stressed, and unless we provide them with a lot of support and guidance, they are not going to be able to make this transition very easily. And of course, COVID has simply, you know, put more stress on all the stress points. So I really think it's important for government to take the lead in showing how it's done with regard to parenting, positive parenting, and we would hope to see in the Children's Amendment Bill going forward more attention being paid to the budgeting and program design around positive parenting.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much. And I will ask you no more. I will ask you no more questions. But thank you very much for your insight, and thank you for the information, and thank you very much for answering the questions. Right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before I allow you to move into the streams, I just want to remind you of the competition. Remember, I said you are sending it to 0722 333 708, and please